With the fall of Florence became embroiled in an international dispute that could lead to the city-state's destruction. It was all happening. Michelangelo gathered because Charles VIII, King of France, had built the first permanent army since Caesar's legions, consisting of some 20,000 trained and heavily armed men. He was now bringing that army across the Alps and into Italy to claim the kingdom of Naples through inheritance. During Lorenzo's lifetime, Charles VIII would have been too friendly to the Medici to threaten a march across Tuscany. If he had Lorenzo's allies, the city-states of Milan, Venice, Genoa, Padua, Ferrara would have closed ranks to keep him out. But Piero had lost 3 allies. The Duke of Milan had sent emissaries to Charles, inviting him to Italy. The Medici cousins, who had been at Versailles for his coronation, assured the king that Florence awaited his triumphal entry. Because of the alliance of the Orsini, his mother's and wife's family, with Naples, Piero refused Charles safe passage. Yet during the months from spring to autumn, he did nothing to assemble soldiers or arms to stop the French king if he did invade. The citizens of Florence, who would have fought Lorenzo, were ready to welcome the French because they would help drive out Piero. Savonarola, too, invited Charles to enter Florence. But by the middle of September, Charles VIII had brought his army across the Alps, been welcomed by the Duke of Milan, and sacked the town of Rapallo. The news threw Florence into a fever. All normal business was suspended. Yet when Charles again sent his emissaries to ask for safe passage, Piero turned them away without a definite answer. The French king vowed to storm through Tuscany and conquer the city. Michelangelo now had a new neighbor in the palace. Piero imported Alfonsina's brother Paolo Orsini to lead 100 mercenaries to stop Charles's army of 20,000. A dozen times Michelangelo vowed he would flee the palace, travel to Venice as Lorenzo had suggested. Loyal to Lorenzo, to Contessina, Giuliano, and even to Cardinal Giovanni, he had no feeling whatever for Piero. He had given him a home, a place to work, and a salary, but he could not bring himself to join the deserters. His 3 years under Lorenzo in the garden and palace had been years of excitement, growth, learning, mastery of his tools and trade, every day a precious jewel to be valued, cherished, every day like a year of maturing. And now, for the better part of these last 2.5 years since Lorenzo's death, he had been stopped in his tracks. He was a better draftsman, yes, thanks to Prior Bisciolini and his months of dissection, but he had felt less alive, less knowledgeable, less creative than he had in the flush of his training by Bertoldo Il Magnifico, Pico, Poliziano, Landino, Ficino, Bienavieni. For a long time, he had been traversing the bottom half of a circle. How did he get into an upward swing again? How did he rise above the tumult, fears, paralysis of Florence? Start his mind and hands working again as a sculptor. How indeed, with even Poliziano going to Savonarola for absolution, beginning in his last words to be taken into the Dominican order so that he could be buried in a monk's habit inside the walls of San Marco. Granacci would give him no counsel. Bugiardini said simply, "If you go to Venice, I go along." When Jacopo heard that Michelangelo was thinking of the journey, he sought him out and cried, "I always wanted to see Venice on somebody else's Florence. Take me along. I will protect you on the road from assassins." By telling them jokes? Jacopo screwed up his face. Laughter is as a lance. What do you say? Agreed, Jacopo. When I leave for Venice, I'll take you with me. On September 21st, Fra Savonarola, in a final effort to drive Pietro out, preached a climactic sermon in the Duomo. Florentines jammed the cathedral. Never before had the friar had such power, and never had his voice rung out with such a clap of doom. The hair of the Florentines stood on end as they cried and lamented, while Savonarola portrayed the destruction of Florence and every living creature in it. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. The friar's faintest whisper pierced the remotest corners of the vast cathedral. Each stone served as a rebounding wall. Michelangelo, standing just inside the doors, felt closed in on every side by a sea of sound, drowning him like rising waters. He returned to the street, surrounded by a mass of people, half dead with fright, speechless, their eyes glassy. Only Prior Bicciolini was calm. But Michelangelo, that is necromancy. From the darkest ages of man, God himself promised Noah and his sons in Genesis 9:9-11, that there would never be a second deluge. Here's a covenant I will observe with you and with your children after you. Nevermore will the living creation be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again a flood to devastate the world. Now tell me, by what right does Savonarola rewrite the Bible? One day Florence is going to find out it has been made a fool of. The prior's soft voice dispelled Savonarola's spell. At that time, you can open the gates of Santo Spirito to him to save him from the mob, suggested Michelangelo. The prior smiled wryly. Can't you imagine Savonarola taking the vow of silence? He'd sooner burn at the stake. The web closed tighter each day. Venice declared himself neutral. Rome declined to provide troops. Charles attacked the frontier fortresses of Tuscany. A few of them fell. Pietrasanta's marble quarrymen put up a good fight, but it could be only a few days before the French army entered Florence. He had little opportunity for rational thought. Alternating hysterias of fear and relief swept the populace. With all the city in the streets, summoned to the Piazza della Signoria by the ringing of the great bell in the tower to hear the news. Was the city to be sacked? The republic overthrown? Was the wealth, art, trade, security, prosperity to be gobbled up by an invading monarch with a powerful army after Florence had lived at peace with the world for so long that it had no more army, weapons, no will to fight? Had the second deluge begun? One morning Michelangelo rose to find the palace abandoned. Piero, Orsini, and their staffs rushed out to treat with Charles. Alfonsina had left with her children and Giuliano for refuge in a hillside villa. Aside from a few old servants, Michelangelo seemed alone. The magnificent palace was frightening in its hollow silence. Lorenzo's body had died in Correggi, and now the great spirit of the man, represented by his magnificent library and artworks, seemed to be dying as well. As he walked the echoing corridors and looked into the big empty room, something of the dread odor of death pervaded them. He ought to know. He who had become an expert in the Santo Spirito dead room. Chaos continued. Piero prostrated himself before Charles, offered the conqueror the coast fortresses, Pisa and Leghorn, and 200,000 florins if he would continue down the coast and avoid Florence. Outraged at this humiliating capitulation, the city council rang the bell on top of the Signoria, summoned the people, and castigated Piero for his cowardice, foolishness, ineptitude. Surrender. A delegation, including Fra Savonarola, was sent to Charles. It ignored Piero. Piero dashed back to Florence to reassert his rights. The city was wild in its rage against him. He demanded to be heard. The crowd yelled, "Go away! Do not disturb the Signoria!" Piero turned away in contempt. The crowd in the piazza wagged their hoods in denunciation. Small gangs of boys hissed a few and threw stones. Piero drew his sword. The crowds chased him through the streets. He disappeared into the palace and diverted the throngs momentarily by having the reigning servants bring out wine and cake. Then couriers came down the street crying, "The Signoria has banished the Medici for life. There is a price of 4,000 florins on Piero's head. Down with Piero!" Entering the palace, Michelangelo found that Piero had escaped through the rear garden, joined Orsini's band of mercenaries at the Porta San Gallo, and fled. Cardinal Giovanni, his fat face red with perspiration from the armload of manuscripts he was carrying. Behind him, 2 of his house servants, also loaded down with fine bindings, was cutting through the garden and out the rear gate to safety. His apprehensive face lit up when he saw Michelangelo. "Buonarroti, I've saved some of Father's rarest manuscripts, the ones he loved best." Florence was only a moment behind. Into the courtyard surged the mob. Cries of "The Medici are banished" were followed with "Everything in the palace is ours." Rioters poured down into the wine cellars, broke open bins, and when they could not edge out the corks, smashed the bottles against the walls. Hundreds of bottles and demijohns passed from hand to hand, mouth to mouth, were drunk from blindly in long, untasting gurgles. The wine spilling so freely it flooded the cellar. Now brutally, this first contingent mounted the stairs, pressing their way down to sack the palace. Michelangelo stood defensively before the Donatello David. The crowd still poured through the main gate, jamming the courtyard. Individual faces that he had seen all his life on the streets and in the piazzas, quiet, good-natured people suddenly inflamed, bent on destruction. With the faceless irresponsibility of the mob, what had caused the change? Was it the sense of being within the Medici palace for the first time as masters rather than outsiders? He was knocked very hard against the David, and a lump was raised on his head. The Donatello, Judith, and Holofernes, standing nearby, was picked up, base and all, and with a roar of approval carried out through the rear garden. What was too big to move, Roman portraits and marble busts, was shattered with smashes of pikes and poles. He edged along the wall, raced up the main staircase, ran at top speed down the corridor to the studiolo, slammed the door behind him, searched for the bolt. There was none. He looked about at the priceless manuscripts, cases of rare cameos, amulets, carved jewels, old coins, the Greek bas-reliefs above the door, the marble and bronze reliefs by Donatello, the painted wooden tables with Giotto's deposition of Christ, Van Eyck's St. Jerome. What could be done to protect them? His eyes fell upon the dumbwaiter. He opened the door, pulled on the ropes, and when the lift was level, began piling in the small paintings, enameled and mosaic tables, cups of jasper, sardonyx and amethyst, a small statue of Plato, a crystal clock mounted on gilt silver, glass vases by Ghirlandaio manuscripts, rings and brooches, the old toothless faun that he had copied for his own piece of sculpture he stuffed inside his shirt. Then he pulled the opposite rope, sent the box down away, and closed the door. A mass of humanity reached the studiolo at that moment and began looting the room like locusts. He fought his way to his own apartment, where he threw Bartoldo's models and a few of the bronzes under the beds. It was the end of the usefulness. Hundreds of rioters were sweeping through the palace and into the great rooms, pilfering the family plate in the dining room, smashing the dishes and glassware, fighting and screaming with joy over the Medici collections of medals and gold and silver, taking from Piero's rooms his cups and trophies, throwing half-full bottles of wine at Pololulo's Hercules and the Lion. In Lorenzo's room he watched helplessly as they grabbed up the 4 jasper vases with Il Magnifico's name inscribed, carried out the painted tables of Masaccio Veneziano, cut paintings out of their frames, ripped sculptures off their bases, smashing the chairs and tables, what was too large to be moved, destroying chests. In the library, rare books and manuscripts had been pulled down from the shelves, the volumes trampled on. Were these Florentines revenging themselves on Piero? But these magnificent collections were not Piero's. Watching the men brutally rip velvet hangings and slash silk upholsteries, he shook his head in despair. Who can look into the mind of a mob? He recognized only one of Medici faithful, his cousin Bernardo Rucellai, Nannina de' Medici's husband, standing before Botticelli's palace, subduing the centaur in the anteroom adjoining a parlor. He was crying out, "You are Florentine citizens! Why are you ravaging your own treasures? Stop, I implore you!" To Michelangelo, he appeared a heroic figure, his eyes blazing and arms outstretched to protect the canvas. Then Rucellai was knocked down. Michelangelo struggled up the prostrate form, picked the man up in his arms, and carried him, leading into a small storage room next door. He thought, ironically, "This is the most intimate contact I have had with my mother's side of the family." The palace was a shambles then in Lorenzo's office. After tearing the maps and tapestries from the walls, some burly porters succeeded in smashing open the safe. Out came a rain of 20,000 florins, which sent the mob into a final paroxysm of joy, and they fought each other for the gold coins. He made his way down the rear staircase and out through the garden. Then through the back alleys to the Ridolfi Palace. He asked a groom for pen and ink, wrote Contessina a brief note, "When it is safe, send someone to your father's studiolo." I loaded the food lift as full as I could. He signed it M.B. He made 2 stops on his way home at Bugiardini's and Jacopo's, leaving word for them to meet him at the Porta San Gallo at midnight. When the city at last slept, he slipped past the quiet houses to Medici stables. 2 of the rooms had stayed with the horses, keeping them quiet during the pandemonium around them. They knew that he had the right to take out horses whenever he desired. They helped him saddle up the 3. He rode 1, led the other 2. There was no guard at the gate. Bugiardini was waiting complacently, standing in the dark, cutting his long fingernails with a knife. Jacopo arrived shortly after. They started out for Venice.